They say Merrow's End was never truly alive, only waiting to die. A mining town choked in sudden silence, clinging to the last of its bloodied riches. But death is not always loud. Sometimes it wears the skin of a boy. It was the 5th of October, 1851, when the fog refused to lift. The sun did rise, the clocks did tick, but all day the shadows held fast to the dirt roads and broken fences. Men muttered about strange pressure in their ears. Women clutched their rosaries a little tighter, and just past dusk, as the oil lamps began to sputter along the path from the hills, a figure emerged. He was perhaps 9, no older. No coat, no hat, no shoes. His feet were muddy, but bore no ounce. His eyes, wide and colorless, did not blink against the cold wind. He did not speak, did not weep. He simply walked slow, straight back down the main road, as if he knew every splinter of the wood beneath him. Old Cormac spotted him first. The tanner, nearly blind from fumes, swore he felt the air pull backward as the boy passed. Said it felt like standing too close to a cliff edge, not dangerous, just wrong. By the time the child reached the town square, a dozen men had gathered. Sheriff Malcolm, town-tired, stepped forward with a lantern raised high. "Son," he asked. The boy looked up. His skin was pale as parchment, his lips faintly blue. No one recognized him, not from the valley, not from the mountain camps. There had been no wagon tracks, no sightings on the northern road. "Where's your family?" the sheriff asked. "You lost." Still, the boy did not speak, only turned, his gaze to the steeple behind the sheriff. The church bell had not rung in 3 weeks, not since Father Harrow fell ill. But now, with no wind and no hand to rope, the bell tolled once, low, hollow. The townsfolk said nothing, not at first, but something ancient stirred behind their ribs. Sheriff Malcolm brought the boy to the station house and wrapped him in a blanket. They tried to feed him. He would not eat, would not sleep. He sat in the corner, watching the window like something. Waited just outside. By morning, the Reverend was dead. They found him in his bed, arms crossed as if laid by mortician's hands. No wounds, no fever. Just gone. The doctor said his lungs were full of ash. The boy remained silent. Days passed. He was given the name Elian by the widow Griggs, who offered to take him in. Her own son had drowned years before, and her home was always too quiet. She bathed Elian, brushed the brambles from his hair, but she confessed later, to her neighbor and to God, that the child never blinked when he looked at her, like his gaze reached somewhere far past her skin. And then came the dreams. First it was her neighbor's daughter, Ruthie. She screamed in her sleep for 3 nights straight. When asked, she could only say, "He was in the well." He smiled with no teeth. On the 4th night, Ruthie vanished. The well in question had been boarded since spring, dry and rotten, but by the time they pried the planks off, all they found inside were claw marks and a single blue ribbon caught on a nail. Elian said nothing. Words spread fast. Some wanted to drive him out. Some whispered about omens, about changelings, about the sins of the fathers. Sheriff Malcolm held firm. "He's just a boy, and boys didn't cause wells to open." But even the sheriff began to leave a Bible by his bed. At night, the air grew colder, denser. Doors refused to stay shut. Horses screamed and bolted in their stalls. And still, Elian walked the streets barefoot at dusk, eyes always toward the church. The bell rang each time he passed, without fail. One evening, Widow Griggs found the child standing at the foot of her bed, not moving, not breathing, just watching. She swore the light behind him flickered blue, like lantern oil catching fire underwater. By the next morning, her house had collapsed in on itself. No storm, no quake, just ruin. Elian crawled free, without a scratch, covered in soot. A carpenter named Thomas Gray took him in after that. A practical man, father of 3. But when his youngest, Lydia, began drawing pictures of the man, with too many mouths, hell at the boy in the cellar, the lock rusted through by dawn. And Lydia? She was never the same. She'd smile for hours at corners where no one stood. She forget how to speak her name. She wrote, again and again, "He comes from the hollow place." They burned her drawings. They prayed louder. But the boy stayed. Why? Did no one stop him? Why not send him away? Because every time someone tried, they vanished. quietly, as though they had never been. Records scratched out, rooms emptied, memories dulled, only the most faithful remembered. One woman claimed she saw Elian in a dream. Standing in a field of mirrors, she said He pointed at her and whispered, "You were never meant to stay." She took her life that same night, and so the town began to change, not just in fear, but in shape. Streets curved oddly, shadows bent the wrong way, clocks ticked counterwise, and still the child walked, barefoot and silent, toward the church, and always, always, the bell would ring. Sheriff Malcolm kept a journal during these weeks, scrawled in the margins of ledgers, on receipts, even on his palm. He wrote of a smell-wet stone, sulfur, copper. It followed Elian like a shadow. He wrote, "Something is being remembered through him." By winter, 10 were dead, 5 missing, and the town had grown, smaller. Buildings felt wrong, distances warped. Some said Marrow's End was folding in on itself, but Elian remained unchanged. No taller, no older, no warmer. He watched, he waited. And somewhere beneath the earth, something creaked. The church bell rang again. And now, I ask you, what would you do if a child knocked at your door, barefoot in the dead of winter, and you could not remember whether you had ever seen your own children's faces before? Would you let him in, or would you shut the door and pray it stays shut? As the sun bled out over the tobacco fields of Marrow's End, a hush fell over the land, not the peaceful kind, but the silence that follows a scream. Crows gathered in the trees without calling. The mist did not rise from the soil, it hung in place, thick and unmoving, as if the earth itself had forgotten how to exhale. And there, at the stone crossroads where no one lingered past sundown, stood a boy. He walked barefoot, his coat too thin for the cold, and in his hands he held a cracked leather satchel. Nanum, no initials, just 2 rusted buckles that clicked like teeth in the wind. It was Reverend Whitlow who found him on his way back from visiting the gravedigger's wife, who'd taken to whispering in sleep about mirrors and hollow laughter. The Reverend rode Amiel named Jonah, and even that creature, dumb and old, refused to move when they near-read the child. Whitlow dismounted, though the air felt wrong in his lungs. "Boy," he called. No answer, just the sound of his own breath, frosting in the air. The child looked up, eyes like old water, deep, still, and already mourning. They didn't plead, didn't flinch. They only acknowledged. Reverend Whitlow was not a soft man. His kindness was carved from stone, and even then, sparingly. But something in him recoiled, not from fear, not from pity, but recognition. The way one might feel when stumbling upon their own grave, half dug and waiting. Still, he could not leave the child, so he took him in. He named him Elias, a biblical name, a safe one. He thought. Elias never protested, never offered his own, and from that first night, Marrow's End began to shiver. The boy was housed in the small parsonage behind the church, a modest place with oil lamps, worn floors, and shelves of books too heavy with judgment. Whitlow offered him soup, bread, a worn blanket. Elias took nothing. He simply stood by the window, staring into the field of rusted crosses behind the church. He didn't sleep. Not that night, not any night after. The Reverend prayed more fervently than usual. By dawn, half the town's dogs were howling without cause, tails between their legs, eyes witty at corners that should have held nothing. Oil lamps flared, hissed, and went dark despite fresh wicks, and across the town, every clock stopped at the same moment, 3:17 a.m. Nothing mechanical could explain it. No surge, no storm. Just stillness, absolute, deafening. At 3:17, even the crickets forgot to sing. Reverend Whitlow recorded it in his journal. Clocks halted, air unnaturally dense. Children moved. Elias sat awake, watching the dark. I felt, if only for a moment, that we had left the world and entered something beneath it. The townsfolk began to murmur. Runaway, some said, mad from cold, but others were not so sure. Martha Graves, who'd recently lost her husband to fever, claimed she had seen the boy in a dream 3 nights prior. He'd stood at the foot of her bed and said only, "There's a gate beneath your house, lock it." She found her husband's grave unearthed the next morning, the coffin empty, no tracks. Others soon confessed similar dreams, A seamstress saw Elias walking backwards through her hallway. A farmer saw him opening a door in the middle of a frozen pond. A school teacher claimed she saw Elias's face in every desk in her classroom, each one smiling differently. The Reverend heard these things and began to fast. On the third day, he confronted the boy. "Where did you come from?" he asked, his voice firm, laced with the authority of cloth and pulpit. Elias turned from the window but said nothing. "Do you remember your name before Elias?" Silence. "Do you dream?" The boy blinked, slowly, then nodded. "What do you dream?" Elias tilted his head. "Of what's still under your town." The Reverend did not sleep that night. He dreamt instead of tunnels wet, breathing, pulsing, walls made of teeth, a bell ringing Derwater, and hands, so many hands, reaching up through soft, crumbling soil. When he woke, his pillow was damp, his hands were blistered, and Elias stood in the doorway, watching. That same morning, Widow Halberd hung herself in the bell tower. Her note read only, "I heard the crying again." But it wasn't human. The church bell rang at 3:17, with no rope attached. Sheriff Marin, newly appointed after Malcolm's sudden disappearance, investigated the child, though investigate was generous. He asked a few half-hearted questions, circled the crossroads with boot tracks, and left muttering about orphans and hysteria. He disappeared 2 nights later. His house was found open, lanterns still burning, boots still by the bed. But no blood, no struggle, just gone. The satchel Elias carried remained untouched. Reverend Whitlow grew obsessed with it. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that it might contain truth. One night, while the boy was out walking the graveyard paths as he often did, the Reverend opened the bag. Inside, a single iron key, rusted nearly to dust, a lock of black hair, bound in red thread. And a page torn from the town's original land ledger. A name scratched out. A plot marked far beyond the church boundary into the woods, where no one had built for decades. No signature, no dates. But something stained the corner of the page. Not blood, not ink, something blacker. The Reverend tried to confront Elias again. Who buried that name? He demanded. Elias only said, "The earth forgets nothing. It only waits." The Reverend, who had lost both son and wife to scarlet fever many years before, found himself weeping that night. He did not know why, only that something in Elias's voice had sounded like his son, had echoed with the exact cadence of a long-dead lullaby. People began to avoid the church. The steeple grew moss despite daily sunlight. Its windows wept condensation in patterns that resembled eyes. The cross above tilted slightly more each day. At 3:17, a scream would echo through the nave. No source, no throat. Just sound. Just grief. And always, Elias would be awake. The last entry in the Reverend's journal reads, "He does not sleep because something watches through him. Not with malice, not yet, but with memory, like a door remembering how to open. I believe he is not the storm, but its herald. Heist the tolling of the bell before the wave, and I am too late." The Reverend vanished on the 7th night. They say the pews were soaked in salt water, that the pulpit was crushed inward, as if something heavy had sat there, and in the dust by the altar, a child's bare footprints led to the quicksand, then stopped. Elias returned to the parsonage that night, alone, silent, satchel in hand. The clocks did not restart. The fields did not warm. And at the crossroads, where he'd first appeared, a second child was seen identical, save for only thing. His eyes were not old, they were empty. Before the town had a name, before the mine's blood lead, and the steeple pierced the sky, there lived a woman on the eastern hill. Her name was Thorn. Some claimed her first name was Esther. Others said it was never spoken aloud. To most, she was simply old Miss Thorn, a weathered widow with one blind eye, 3 dead husbands, and the strange gift of seeing things before they arrived. No one visited her unless they were desperate. She spoke to no one unless spoken to, and yet, on the 6th day of Elias's arrival, she came down from the hills, barefoot, mud streaked to her knees, a single braid hanging over her shoulder like a noose. The townsfolk watched from behind curtains and fences as she walked through the square, never pausing, never looking left or right until she reached the church doors. She pushed them open. Without knocking. Inside, Reverend Whitlow stood before the altar, voice hoarse from prayer. He turned, startled not by her presence, but by the certainty in it. "I know what he is," she said before he could speak. He frowned. "You speak of the boy?" Miss Thorne's blind eye twitched. "He ain't a boy." Reverend Whitlow stepped forward. "Then what is he?" She hesitated, not from doubt, but from weariness. "He's memory and flesh," she said softly. "The shape pain takes when it's old enough to walk." Whitlow stiffened. "You speak in riddles." "I speak in warnings." Her good eye was sharp as a blade. "You think he's yours to help, to shepherd. But he don't need saving, Reverend. He's not here for redemption. He's here for remembrance." Whitlow crossed his arms. "And what would you have me do? Cast him into the wild, leave him to the wolves?" She took a slow step forward. "Send him away. Bury that which shouldn't. Wear skin, while you still can." But the Reverend, ever loyal to Scripture, to ritual, to duty, shook his head. "He is in my care, and until I am shown otherwise, he remains." Old Miss Thorne didn't speak again, only sighed a long, hollow thing that sounded more like grief than breath. She turned, walked out of the church, and did not look back. That night, the hills glowed orange, her cabin dry as tinder. Wrapped in fog went up in flames that lit the stars. The townsfolk gathered too late. All they found was soot, smoke, and her body, curled at Theodore as if she had tried to crawl through, but changed her mind halfway. In her palm, fused by melted flesh and faith, was her rosary, every bead scorched black, every cross bent inward. No prince surrounded the wreckage, no lightning, no storm. And in the highest window of the church steeple, a silhouette stood small, motionless. Elias, watching. Some claimed his eyes glowed faintly. Others swore the reflection was merely the fire. But Nana could forget the stillness of his face. The fire didn't frighten him. It fulfilled him. In the following days, the land soured. The crops yellowed before harvest. The corn wept sap. The tobacco leaves curled and blackened at the edges. A heifer gave birth to something with no eyes. Chickens laid eggs filled with blood. At first, Reverend Whitlow said nothing. He walked with heavier steps, lingered longer in the pulpit, and prayed into the cracks of the church floor until his voice turned hoarse and broken. He read from Isaiah, from Job, from the darker Psalms. He began to wear black even on Sundays, as if in mourning, as if already preaching a funeral he could not name. Whispers slithered between houses. They called it a blight, a curse, a punishment. Some pointed to the mind, said the earth had grown tired of being carved. But more and more, fingers turned toward the child. He never aged, never ached, never blinked longer than needed. He still never ate. Though bread was set out each morning, he never slept, yet never yawned. But the worst, what truly curdled the blood, was that those who touched Elias began to fade. Not all at once, not loudly. But subtly. It began with chills, then coughing, then forgetfulness. By the third day, their skin took on a pale, waxen sheen like candle stubs before they melt. Mrs. Delling, who had stroked the boy's hair when he first arrived, was found shivering in the woods naked and reciting nursery rhymes. Her husband tried to bring her home, but she screamed when she saw the church spire, calling her own eyes. By morning, she was gone. No trail, no blood. Only her nightgown, folded neatly beside the well. Sheriff Marin's deputy, young Abram, confessed in a whisper that Elias had brushed his hooder in passing. 2 days later, Abram's bones began to ache with such intensity he drank to quiet them. He died with his mouth open and his fists clenched. The townsfolk begged the Reverend, send him away, lock him up, do something. But Whitlow refused. He spoke of trials, of tests, of the Lord's mysterious ways. He told them that to abandon a child was to damn their own souls, that Elias was not a plague but a mirror, a reflection of their own buried sins. But even he didn't believe it anymore. Each night, he sat on the church steps with his Bible unopened, staring at the satchel that Elias kept near his bed. He had never dared open it again. He no longer dreamed of tunnels, of water, of mouths. Now he dreamed of a place with no shape, only echoes, thousands of them, all repeating the same word: return, 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 return. The town's children began to sleepwalk. They'd be found standing at the edge of the fields, whispering to something in the soil. One boy was caught trying to dig into the church graveyard with a spoon. When asked why, he said, "She's still down there." But she forgot her face. The Reverend buried his cross in the yard behind the church, not out of apostasy but fear. Heck could no longer bear the feel of it near his skin. It pulsed cold, like metal left in the river too long. He tried to speak with Elias one final time, that it was just past dusk. The child sat in the chapel pew, still and straight, facing forward. Whitlow sat beside him. "I've prayed for you," he whispered, "every day, every night, and I have not stopped believing." Elias turned. "I never asked you to." The Reverend swallowed. "Then what are you here for?" The boy's eyes gleamed, not malicious, not empty, just old. To finish remembering, he stood and walked down the aisle, small feet echoing against old wood. As he passed, the lanterns flickered out. Outside, the bell tolled. No hand touched the rope. That night, the church windows wept again. And somewhere, in the far corners of Merrow's End, something long buried took a breath. Merrow's End was not a place of laughter, but even its stillness had once held the rhythm of life, children kicking stones, reciting rhymes in the schoolyard, laughter that trembled like uncertain bells. That changed the week Miss Liddy Harris insisted Elias join her classroom. She was a proud woman, young but stern, with a posture sharp enough to correct behavior before words ever passed her lips. The town respected her, thought her brave for staying after the mines closed and many fled. She taught 12 children in the chapel's side hall, boys with knobby knees, girls with smudged dresses, all fidgeting beneath the tired gaze of a blackboard older than any of them. When Miss Harris asked Reverend Whitlow why the boy did not attend school, he hesitated. "He does not speak," he said. "Then he will learn to listen," she replied. She did not ask Elias if he wished to attend. She simply took his hand, walked him into that chapel-turned classroom, and placed him in the back row, beside the stove. He sat as if he'd always belonged there. But children know, in ways adults have forgotten. They feel the edges of things of what does not fit. They mocked him at first. Sarah Coyle, mayor's daughter and sharp-tongued ringleader, leaned across her slate with a crooked grin. "Why don't you talk?" she asked him, to dumb or to full of secrets. Elias blinked. That was all. Sarah began to laugh, and then, without warning, she screamed. Not a startled cry, not a childish wail. A scream pulled from the depth of her body like a soul being wrung out. Her arms seized, her back arched, her eyes rolled back so violently it looked as if she were trying to unsee something that had already taken root behind her lids. Miss Harris rushed to her side, but the damage was already done. Blood bloomed across Sarah's throat like red lace. Her voice was torn away in a single breath. She never spoke again. Doctors came, ministers prayed. No explanation. The next day, the classroom was silent. Not the usual hush of focused study, but an oppressive, unnatural stillness. Children sat rigid. Not one whispered. No pages turned. No pencils scratched. Miss Harris, unnerved, rang the dismissal bell early. No one moved. They remained seated, eyes fixed forward, faces slack, as if waiting for a cue. Only Elias Koljiv. And there he stood, not in the back row now, but in the center, surrounded by 12 empty gazes. He didn't move, didn't speak, but Miss Harris swore later, in whispers to the Reverend before her hands began to shake too violently to hold her tea, that Elias's eyes were flickering, not with light, but with images. She said it was like watching a lantern strobe through memories too quickly to catch. Fields. Ash screams, faces, hundreds of faces, and one scream, always repeating, behind them all. That night, she didn't go home. She sat in the chapel pew long past dark, reciting verses under her breath. Her fingers turned white from clutching her rosary too tightly. No one saw her leave. But by morning, she was found in her home, head submerged in her own wash basin, knees bent awkwardly beneath her. Her hands were clasped in prayer. Her mouth was full of water and blood. There were no signs of struggle. No broken glass, no tracks. Just her final entry in the schoolhouse log, ink smeared with trembling strokes. He stands in the place where time folds inward. The children no longer dream for themselves. I've seen what's using their eyes. Sheriff Marin had enough. He stormed into the chapel the next morning, revolver at his hip, face pale with fury. He found Elias sitting on the front pew, hands folded neatly, satchel at his feet. "Boy," Marin growled, "I want answers. Now, no response. I don't care what you are or what you saw. This town is tearing itself apart, and you sit here like some goddamn statue." Elias looked up. There was no fear in him, no defiance, only stillness. And for a moment, Marin hesitated, not because he feared the boy but because he felt himself slipping, felt a warmth trickle from his nose, a memory he didn't recall living, a woman's hand, a cradle of fire, a door that pulsed with breath. He stumbled back, choking. "What are you?" Elias said nothing, but outside, the bell tolled once, and every child in town turned their head, in perfect unison, toward the steeple. Marin backed away from the boy, his hand never leaving the pistol. He did not draw it. He never would. That night, he began to bleed from the ears. 2 days later, he shot himself in the heart. The town did not mourn. By then, half the citizens locked their doors at dusk. The other half never opened theirs at all. Children stopped attending school. Some refused to speak. Others only hummed soft, tuneless songs that made dogs wail and horses rear. A traveling peddler passed through Marrow's End and called it a cursed place. He sold no goods, just left a scrap of paper nailed to the tavern door. "The child is not your punishment. He is your ledger, and someone is collecting." The Reverend burned the note without reading it aloud, but he kept the ashes in a jar by his bed. The air itself grew thick. People began to speak in whispers, even during the day. They forgot birthdays, faces blurred. One woman swore her husband never existed. Though they'd shared a bed for 12 years, the ground around the schoolhouse turned soft, even during frost, as if the soil itself had begun to weep. Inside the chapel, Elias remained. He did not leave the pew for 2 days. On the third, a child knocked on the church door. It was Sarah Coyle, her mouth stitched shut with thread, her eyes unblinking. She handed the Reverend a folded page. Inside, a drawing. The classroom, empty, except for a single figure at the front. Elias, behind him, 12 shapes tall, thin, bone white with mouths where their eyes should be, and above them all, a gate, hung in the sky like a wound. The rain began just after nightfall, a sharp, bitter curtain that fell with such suddenness it seemed summoned. Lightning forked through the hills like the cracking of old skin, and thunder old not above, but beneath the ground, deep and heavy as a drum sounded for war. Within the chapel, candles flickered and hissed, their flames bent not by wind, but by something colder, something that watched. Reverend Whitlow, gaunt and sleepless, stood alone behind the pulpit, his bones aching from weeks of kneeling. The church had emptied weeks ago. No prayers, no choir, no congregation. Only Elias remained, always seated in the front pew, as still as stone. Whitlow opened his Bible, and the words bled. Not metaphorically, not poetically, they bled. Every line, every chapter, every blessed word had turned to smears of oily black. The pages clung together with dampness. The ink melted into itself, like flesh burned in a furnace, all except tone passage perfectly preserved, clear and bold, as though inked fresh by some invisible hand. Ezekiel 6:14, "And I will make thy cities desolate, and bring thy sanctuaries to ruin." Whitlow stared at it for a long time. He had read that verse before, long ago, but never had it stirred him. Not like this. That night, he did not sleep. He stood before the altar until dawn, whispering passages from memory, not as scripture beauties, incantation, as if trying to hold back something already inside the walls. And when Sunday came, he preached, not to the town, not to Elias. To God. The sermon was not holy, it was hollow. No hymns, no peace, just a ragged voice echoing off rotting beams. "We are vessels, Lord, but perhaps some vessels are shaped for sorrow, some for fire, and some for remembrance." His voice cracked, his hands trembled. "You sent your son in the shape of a man. Did you now send him in the shape of a child? To remind us of the sins we buried, to count the bones beneath our fields." The few townsfolk who dared pass the chapel later whispered that the Reverend had lost his faith. They were wrong. He had lost the illusion of it. 2 days later, Whitlow made the journey to Lexington. He left Elias behind, though not without fear. The child had become part of the church's air, part of its shadow. But Whitlow could no longer carry the weight alone. He returned 3 days later, pale and speechless. The clergy from Lexington had never arrived. Their carriage was found overturned. In the woods near the northern ridge, wheels shattered, a sieve crushed by a giant hand. The driver was gone. Not dead, not mutilated, simply gone. The horses were found tied to a tree. Blindfolded and trembling, the priests' collars were found scattered through the mud, each one soaked through as if from weeping. Reverend Whitlow wrote in his journal that night, "If they cannot enter the valley, then the valley is no longer part of the world. We have fallen, quietly, no trumpet, no horseman, just a child." But that was not all he confessed. In a later entry, scrawled with such force the ink bled through for pages, he wrote, "I dreamt him before he came. Months, perhaps years. I thought it madness, grief, but the dreams were always the same: a field, a grave, an open pit in the earth that breathed like lungs filled with ash, and a child standing at the edge barefoot, waiting, watching, not with malice, not with joy, just with knowing." He continued, "He looked at me in every dream as if to say it's time." The Reverend had once believed he was Elias's savior, that he'd been chosen to show compassion in a world grown cold. Now he wondered if he had been chosen not to shield but to signal, not a shepherd, but a herald. He tried to tell the townsfolk. He knocked on doors in the rain, his voice broken with pleading. "We must send him back," he whispered, "not a way back. He is not lost. He is not alone. He is memory, shaped like a child, and memory has come to collect what is owed." They didn't understand. Most wouldn't open the door. The ones who did closed it faster when they saw the look in his eyes. One woman, Mrs. Keller, asked him why he no longer wore his cross. The Reverend looked down. He hadn't realized it was gone. That night, lightning struck the chapel steeple. The cross atop it rusted, tilted, snapped, and fell through the roof, embedding itself in the pulpit like a blade. No fire, no collapse, just a perfect, silent puncture. Elias did not flinch. He simply reached up and touched the iron with one hand. It sizzled, but his skin did not burn. Reverend Whitlow watched from the doorway, soaked to the bone, clutching his journal like a shield. He wept, not from fear, but because he knew now it had never been his decision to make. Elias had come. That much was true, but Elias had always been coming, and Whitlow, he had simply been waiting. Merrow's End lived by routine. The roosters crowed at dawn. The miners whistled at dusk, and every Sunday morning, the bells off St. Irenaeus tolled for times to call the faithful. It was the town's rhythm, small, stubborn, and steady, a rhythm that gave shape to its people. But on the first Sunday of November, the rhythm broke. At precisely midnight, the bells began to ring. No hand pulled the ropes, no wind stirred the air. Yet the bells rang wild and slow, like grief echoing through iron lungs. The first strike woke the widow Coyle, who sat up and clutched her chest, convinced she had heard her husband's voice buried beneath the chime. The second startled the blacksmith's horses into frenzy. They trampled the frost-hardened dirt until their hooves split, screaming with eyes rolled white. By the third toll, every dog in Merrow's End had vanished. No prints, no blood, no bark, just silence. The bells did not stop. They rang from midnight until dawn. With each toll, something changed. Mirrors cracked, not shattered, but split through the center, as if the glass had seen something it could not bear. In every home, every hallway, every dresser drawer, reflections became disjointed. One woman swore her mirror self blinked 3 times before her own eyes moved. Fires would not catch. The hearth stayed cold. Bread spoiled on the table. Lamps flickered andied, leaving only breath, frost, and shadow. Children whimpered in their sleep, murmuring names their parents had never taught them. And in the frost-hung streets, Elias walked, barefoot, silent, untouched by snow, untouched by wind. Where he stepped, the frost did not crack. No footprints marked his path. Yet every window he passed wept condensation from within. As though the houses themselves had begun to grieve. Old Mrs. Hepsworth was found seated in her rocker, tears streaming. from eyes she swore had seen only joy the night before. "I don't know why I'm crying," she whispered, "but I feel I've forgotten something terrible, something I promised never to remember." 3 elderly men collapsed without warning. One gripped his cane and said, "They've come back to finish what we left beneath the mine." He died before anyone could ask what he meant. In the blacksmith's cottage, a scream never came. His wife, Elise, had been heavy with child. She was due any day. But when the bells began, she fell quiet. Her husband found her sitting on the blood-soaked floor, rocking something swaddled in old cloth. It did not cry. Its eyes were open, fully formed, wide and gray like polished ash. Its lips had been stitched shut, not sewn, but grown that way, as if the mouth itself had never been allowed to speak. Elise would not let go of the child. Not for hours, not until the cold claimed her hands and that child stiffened against her chest. She whispered only once, to no one. He smiled before he died, just once, like he knew this was always meant. The child was buried by moonlight. No service, no stone. By the next morning, half the town had locked their doors from the inside, curtains drawn, meals untouched, fires cold. The snow began to fall around midday, but not the kind that softened the world. This snow watery, bone white, and fell straight down with no wind, as if dropped from unseen hands. Reverend Whitlow did not ring the morning bell. He did not preach. He did not rise. They found him collapsed in his study, face pale, eyes open but unfocused. His lips moved, barely audible. At first they thought he prayed, but when the physician leaned close, he heard the name, one word, whispered again and again through cracked lips, Thalio. None recognized it. Not in scripture, not in census, not in any sermon Whitlow had ever delivered, but the name carried a weight, as though it had been carved out of the town itself, erased, then remembered. That night, the Reverend did not sleep. He sat upright in his bed, staring at the far wall. When asked if he knew the name, he did not answer, but he wept, not like a man afraid, like a man who had finally remembered what he had spent a lifetime trying to forget. Outside, Elias stood in the snow across from the chapel. Still, silent. And every few seconds, the bell tolled once more, though the rope remained untouched and steeple long splintered. One man, drunk with grief and fury, tried to strike Elias with a spade. He was found the next morning, seated beside his own grave. No wound, no blood. Just dirt beneath his nails and a look of peace so unnatural. His wife refused to touch him. She said, that smile, that wasn't his. By the third night, the bells stopped, but something had settled in their place, a pressure, not loud, not violent. Just constant. A cold that lived inside the walls now, inside bones, inside breath. Even the sky seemed dimmer. The moon, when visible, was pale and cracked, like a great eye slowly closing. One by one, the townsfolk stopped, speaking of Elias. Not out of fear, out of inevitability. He was no longer the strange child, no longer the mystery. He had become a truth, a known shape, like winter or rot. And beneath it all, the word persisted, THALIL. Written once in the frost on a window, heard in the wind behind a mourner's sigh, carved faintly on the inside of a cellar door. The name did not belong to any man, but it had always belonged to Merrow's End. By the second week of November, Sheriff Josiah Hargrove had not slept more than an hour at a time. His eyes were red-rimmed, his boots cracked from pacing, and his fingers trembled with the first hints of delirium. The town had frayed, unraveling thread by thread. Church bells rang with Athens, frost crawled up walls from within, and children no longer played. They only watched. Hargrove, a man of logic and law, had once scoffed at the stories. He called it panic, called it grief, but now he called it something else. Pattern. He began to search not for the boy, but for the origin. He believed, perhaps naively, that if Heck could trace the first thread, he could unravel the knot. In the cellar of the courthouse, beneath mold-slicked shelves and rat-chewed files, he found it, a bound ledger, wrapped in oilskin, brittle as old bone. It was dated 1784, 67 years ago. The ink had faded, but the script remained legible, tight cursive with hurried strokes. The first entry was mundane: land disputes, supply shortages, winter grain. But several pages in, a different hand had taken over. The penmanship changed, slanted, and panicked. A child came down the ridge this morning, alone. No name, no age, no prints in the snow. Wetukiman. Hargrove's stomach turned. He read on. He says nothing, eats nothing, sleeps with his eyes open. Deaths began on the third day. Old widows wept in their sleep. Animals turned hollow. Clocks stopped. Fires failed. We named him Elias. The ledger went on to recount the unraveling of that earlier Marrow's End. Entire families lost. Snow that fell black as soot. A preacher who went blind from staring too long into the boy's eyes. And finally, we buried the church bell. We salted the crossroads. We sealed the grave beneath the alder tree. And still he watched. Until one morning, he was gone. The snow melted the next day. Every 67 years, it will begin again. Hargrove sat with the book in his lap. Long after finishing, the candle beside him had burned to Anub. Shadows pressed against the cellar walls like listening things. He took the ledger straight to the Reverend. Whitlow did not speak as he read, but his hands shook. When he finished, he set the book down gently, as though it might scream. "He's not a curse," the Reverend whispered. "He's not even a boy." Hargrove stared. "Then what is he?" Whitlow didn't answer. Instead, he closed his eyes and repeated the name he had muttered days before, Thalio. The Reverend did not know where he had heard it, but now he understood when. Not in his lifetime, but in another. The same boy, the same silence, the same cycle. Marrow's End wasn't being punished, that it was being reminded. The sheriff stood, leather creaking beneath his coat. He looked older than he had just Arsago. His face was hollow, but his resolve was iron. "I don't care if he's a ghost or god or devil," Hargrove said. "I won't watch this town die on its knees." The Reverend, weary beyond years, did not argue, but he did not hope either. Hargrove left the chapel just before dusk. He loaded his rifle with trembling hands, each bullet pressed in. Like a final prayer, he wiped Thebrel clean, oiled the mechanism, and tested the trigger once, twice, 3 times. No jam. No fault. Just cold steel and purpose. He sat on his porch, eyes locked on the horizon where the mist gathered like old breath. Behind him, the sky bled rust, and the wind smelled of snow and ash. He waited. Elias did not keep him waiting long. The child emerged from the fog as if peeled from it barefoot. Coatless, skin untouched by chill, his satchel swung gently at his side. His eyes held no malice, no fear. Just recognition, like he had seen Hargrove before. And perhaps he had. Perhaps they had danced the scene a dozen times, 100. Each man given his one chanchetto changed the ending. And failing. Elias stepped onto the porch. He did not speak. He simply folded his hands and looked up. Sheriff Hargrove leveled the rifle. "I don't care what you are," he said. His voice cracked from thirst. "You don't belong here." Elias said nothing. "You hear me?" Still nothing. Hargrove squeezed the trigger. Click. Nothing. He checked the chamber. Loaded. Again. Click. The mechanism refused to fire. The rifle, still, warm in his hands, would not obey. Elias tilted his head. Not mocking, not amused. Understanding. The way one might look at a child trying to cage the ocean in a bottle. Sheriff Hargrove stood slowly. The rifle hung limp in his grip. "I tried," he whispered. "I tried to stop it." Elias blinked once, as if to say, "You were never meant to," and then, without a sound, he turned and walked back into the mist. Hargrove stood alone on his porch. Until morning, when his wife came to find him, he was seated, eyes wide, rifle across his knees. His lips were blue. His breath was gone. But his expression, it was not fear. It was recognition, as though something had finally come full circle. That evening, the town's clocks began to run backward, and the frost sank deeper into the wood. By late November, the land itself had begun to rot. It didn't start loud. It started with the taste of the water, metallic, thick. Then the bread spoiled before it rose. Then the tobacco plants curled in on themselves like closing hands. But one field was different. It belonged to the McKinnon family. It had been in their line since before the Civil War. Tall rows of tobacco, thick and veined, usually the last to brown before the first frost. But now, the leaves dripped sap like blood. The stems cracked without touch, and no bird circled overhead. One morning, a laborer's foot sunk 6 inches into the earth. Not mud, not root, but something else. Something soft and round. They dug, not for harvest, but for clarity, for reason. What they found was neither. Beneath the soil less than a foot downward teeth, rows of them. Small, human. Milk teeth, mostly, some with roots, some capped in gold or iron. Many so clean they glinted in the gray light, and they weren't scattered. They were planted, lined and neat, curving rows like seeds, like crops. Dozens, then hundreds. So many that the digging stopped, not from exhaustion, but from terror. One man reached down and pulled out a gold incisor. He turned it over in shaking fingers. It had a hairline fracture in the enamel and a tiny initial carved into the crown. T. Reverend Whitlow, brought to the site by shaking townsfolk, recognized it before he even held it. Miss Thorne, she had lost that tooth decades ago. He remembered when she'd laughed after it fell, said it was the last thing God owed her. And now it was here. Not in a grave, but in a field. In the ground. Planted, as if she had always been meant to be grown back. The Reverend dropped to one knee. He tried to pray, but no words came. Instead, the ground beneath them trembled, a soft, rhythmic pulse, like breath or heartbeat. And then came the singing, not loud, not beautiful. It was wrong. High-pitched, melodic, but dissonant, as though the notes were being sung by mouths that didn't quite know how. No words, just melody. Familiar, yet entirely unnatural. The workers dropped their tools, covered their ears. One man fell to his knees, whispering the names of children he'd never fathered. Another began to hum along until blood spilled from his ears, and he collapsed face first in tough soil. They fled, all of them, except the Reverend, who stood frozen, eyes locked on the place where the singing rose loudest. At dusk, Elias walked the field. No one invited him. No one dared stop him. He passed through the rows of withered stalks, his head tilted slightly as if listening, and as he did, every dog in Marrow's End howled, not barked, not growled. Howled. Long, anguished, primal cries that pierced the sky and cracked windows. Some tried to muzzle their hounds, others locked them in cellars, but nothing helped. The dogs thrashed until their throats gave out. By morning, not one could make a sound, and then 3 children were gone. Jonah Kemp, Leela Bourne, Timothy Hale. All vanished. No doors broken, no signs of entry. Their beds were neatly made, but their shoes were found lined up carefully at the chapel door. Polished. Laced. As if to say, they don't need them anymore. Reverend Whitlow stood before the church that morning, eyes swollen, lips cracked from uttering half-prayers. When he saw the shoes, something in him buckled. He staggered into the chapel. Elias sat alone, as always, in the front pew. The Reverend approached him once with the gait of a leader, now on shaking legs, his clerical collar torn loose at the neck. He fell to his knees before the boy. Begging. Not in fire and brimstone. In grief. Please, he whispered. Just speak. Say anything. Tell me what you are. Why this is happening. Why they. His voice broke. I tried. I held the line. I opened the door. Was that what I was meant to do? Was that the test? No answer. Elias blinked once, and for a moment, the chapel filled with warmth. Not comfort, but memory. The air smelled of pine and soot, of bread burned just before supper, of old hymnals and dry earth, and the Reverend remembered something from childhood. A voice not his mother's, nor God's, but familiar all the same. There will come a winter with no snow, only silence, and in that silence, the boy will walk, and you must let him. He'd forgotten it until now, or maybe he had never known it at all. He looked up at Elias, breath catching in his throat. You're not here to be stopped, are you? The boy did not move. Outside, the wind picked up, the snow fell heavier, and somewhere in the fields, something began to hum again. Snow fell hard over Marrow's End that night, not in drifts or softness, but in sharp, needle-like shards that scoured the windows, hissed through the keyholes, and left splinters in the skin. Nothing moved. Not even the wind dared speak. Inside the chapel, Reverend Whitlow knelt before the altar. Where faith once stood and only ash remained. He had stopped preaching. He had stopped praying. But he had not stopped wondering. What is he? He thought he'd known. He thought Elias was the echo of the town's sin, a reckoning. An ancient clock wound by the hands of the dead. But then came the knock. 3 slow taps on the chapel door. Not frantic, not pleading. Just old. Behind the door stood a woman, wrapped in layers of faded wool and memory. May, his mother's childhood nanny. Her face was a map of age, her eyes cataracted and milky, but Hermond, somehow, was sharp, sharpened by something long buried and left to rot. She didn't ask to come in. She simply said, "I've kept this too long." Whitlow stepped aside. Silent, May didn't sit. She stood before the pulpit where he had once preached fire and now clung on lithodos. She took a breath that sounded like the breaking of old paper. "Your mother was 17, she said. Pretty, quiet, bit of darkness in her. She got that from her father." Whitlow froze. May went on, voice steady. "She gave birth one winter night, same as this one. I was there. I caught him, a boy." The Reverend's throat dried. "I'm the only." May shook her head. "No, you were born second. A year later, she buried the first. Or so wettled everyone." A pause. "He died, Whit. He did. No breath, no cry. But he looked at me. I swear it. With those gray eyes. Like he knew." The world tipped under the Reverend's feet. May closed her eyes. "We didn't bury him in the ground. Your mother insisted. Said he'd come back wrong if the earth took him. She stitched his mouth shut with black twine. Said it would keep his soul from laking." Whitlow's legs gave out. He collapsed into the front pew. She made me help her hide him under the chapel. Said God would keep him quiet there. May turned and walked away, cane tapping the chapel stones. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "But sorry don't undo anything. He was your brother." And she Medejer he was never remembered. She disappeared into the snow. Whitlow didn't sleep that night. Instead, he tore open the chapel floorboards. With bare hands, splintered wood, and a strength born of horror, he peeled back layers of dust and age, unearthing the chapel's foundation, bone by bone. And beneath the altar, tucked in a cavity of stone and straw, lay a cradle, not decayed. Not broken. Preserved. Inside it, wrapped in yellowed linen, was a small, mummified infant, its flesh dry, its eyes closed, its skin drawn tight like brittle wax, and its mouth had been stitched with thick, black twine, threaded so carefully, so intentionally, that even in death, it looked silenced. Not mourned. Bound. Whitlow reached down. His fingertips brushed the cradle's edge, and above him, the air split. Elias screamed. The sound was not human. Not merely grief, or fury, or pain. It was all of them, and more. It rang through the chapel and shattered every window at once. Glass rained like ash. Birds dropped from the air. Men woke vomiting. Women wept without knowing why. And every mirror in Marrow's End turned black from within. The dogs began to howl again. Voiceless now, mouths open wide, but making no sound. The snow began to melt. Not slowly, but all at once. As if the ground had sighed. As if winter itself had been released. Streams formed in the streets, washing away blood, soot, and memories too old for the tongue. Time folded, truly folded, for a moment. It was 1784 again. A man in his nightshirt swore he saw his long-dead mother knocking on the window. Children called out to names never taught to them. An old miner wandered into the tavern and asked for the drink he'd died clutching 40 years ago. The Reverend knelt beside the cradle, his face soaked in sweat and tears. He looked up. Elias was there. Inside the chapel now. No longer at the pew. No longer the quiet figure of dread. He stood just feet from the cradle, watching. His eyes, always still, now trembled. A single tear slid down his cheek. The Reverend rose slowly, cradling the tiny, broken body in his arms. "You came back," he said, voice raw. "You came for this." The boy blinked once. The twine at the infant's mouth loosened, not by hand, not by blade, but as if time itself had surrendered. The stitches fell away like autumn leaves, and Elias took a step forward. Whitlow looked into the boy's face, into the face that might have been his brother. his twin, his sin. He whispered, "You came for what was left of you." Elias closed his eyes, and the chapel lights blew out, one by one, not from wind, but from rest. Morning came without violence. The storm had broken in the night, not with lightning or thunder, but with a long, soft sigh that noon remembered hearing only. Feeling, the sky, once bruised and grayed with centuries of unspoken rot, turned pale as washed linen. The snow had melted into dark veins through the streets, the kind that never quite dry, and the chapel stood open. Both doors swung wide, creaking gently in the soft breeze, as though someone had only just stepped through them, or as though the building itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Inside, silence. No pews overturned, no blood, no scorched wood or torn hymnals. Just absence. Elias was gone. So was Reverend Whitlow. No graves were dug that day. No bodies were found. They simply weren't. The pulpit still stood, shadowed by fractured morning light pouring through broken windows. And there, upon it, open and undisturbed, was a journal. Whitlow single quotes S. The final entry bled through the page, its ink warped slightly by tears or perhaps by something older, something deeper. He was never meant to be born, and yet, he always will be. The handwriting had changed, shakier than previous entries, as though the hand that wrote it belonged to both a man and the boy he once was. A few in town claimed they saw the Reverend and Elias walking toward the woods that night, shoulder to shoulder, but they were dreams. Or so it was easier to say. The town did not hold a funeral, not for Elias, not for the Reverend, not for the 3 children who had vanished, or the horses that had turned wild, or the prayers that had stopped working. Merrow's End simply resumed, because that is what small towns do after their skin has split and healed over. They forget, slowly. Names faded. Some people remembered Miss Thorne, but not what became of her. Others recalled a schoolmarm who once drowned, but couldn't recall her name or her scream. Sheriff Hargrave's house was boarded up and left to weather until vines took it and the porch full in. No one mentioned the cradle beneath the floorboards, and no one not once spoke of the child who had come barefoot to the crossroads, who had watched from pews and graveyards and fields of buried teeth. Instead, people rebuilt, babies were born, shops reopened, the tobacco grew again, though it was never as sweet, and the fields always seemed to tilt just slightly toward the chapel ruins. But no one walked past the crossroads after dark. No one asked why. Not even the new preacher who came from up north and claimed to hear whispering in the trees. He left after 3 nights, didn't pack, just vanished. Years passed, then decades, and time did what it always does. It dulled the edges of the blade, but never removed it entirely. Some said the story of Elias became a fable told to children, to keep them indoors. Others swore it had been real, but lost, burned, buried, or rewritten. And then came the year 1918. The world was at war. Men from Merrow's End, now renamed Hollow's Mercy, were Seniversias. The influenza tore through families. The world itself felt fragile, fraying at the seams. But it wasn't until November that the town remembered what it was built on. The girl was seen just after dawn. A farmer's boy first spotted her, standing alone at the stone crossroads. Barefoot, clutching a satchel with no name. She didn't cry, didn't move, just stared. Her eyes were old, not like a child pretending to be wise, but like someone who had seen too much and forgotten too little. When asked her name, she said nothing, only blinked. Once, the same way he had. The sheriff at the time, no kin to Hargrove, ordered her brought to the church, but she walked ahead of them, unbothered, as if she already knew the way. The preacher refused to speak her name. He took off his collar and hung himself in the bell tower that night. There was no scream, just silence, and the slow return of winter. The mayor declared an emergency. The council convened, and the people of Hollow's Mercy did the one thing they had never dared. They burned the records. Every ledger, every journal, every census from 1784 to 1851. The church itself was leveled, salted. The crossroads were buried beneath stone and sand. The child was never seen again, but from that day forward, the name Merrow's End was forbidden. The town became Hollow's Mercy. And that is what was carved into its signs and stitched into its memory. But mercy, like memory, is a brittle thing. And in the decades that followed, when snow falls too early, or the dogs bark at empty fields, or a child stares too long at their own reflection, some still whisper, he was never meant to be born, and yet he always will be.